it's Susan from the Noonan Carnegie Library, and I'm here with more photography tips from Susan. Today we're going to be discussing the exposure triangle. Now, the exposure triangle is one of the most important concepts in photography because this is how you are able to take a good and decent exposure, especially when you're using the DSLR camera. Now, there's some apps on iPhones and Androids that can allow you to change these three elements, but mostly this applies to other types of photography, like with a real camera, like a digital single lens reflex camera and cameras like that. But like I said, there are some apps where you can have more control over things on like a phone or even on your little point and shoot. Some let you do it as well. So the exposure triangle is just what it sounds like. It's a triangle made up of three different elements, and all of these three elements have to work together, and that's how you get a perfect exposure or perfect photo. So we're going to be talking about these three elements today and how they all work together to create that perfect photo. The first element that we're going to be talking about today is shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the shutter is open and letting light in to create a photo. So shutter speed is measured in seconds and fractions of a second, so we're working with pretty small numbers here. So when you're looking at your camera and you're changing your shutter speed, you'll see there's all sorts of different things. Depending on what camera it is, your shutter speed will go to different levels. So for instance, I like to start on like 1/30th of a second. So that's 1/30th of a second, the shutter is open and the light is coming in. Now, that's a pretty low, what we would call a low shutter speed. So the other function of shutter is to freeze the motion. So if you're shooting on 1/30th of a second, you might be like, ooh, everything's blurry, and it's because it's so low, it doesn't have a chance to freeze that action. So you may have to raise up your shutter speed. So then that would be where you would go into the other elements of the triangle if you don't have enough light and adjust those. The faster the shutter speed is, the more it will freeze the action, and the lower the shutter speed is, the more it might blur it. Now, sometimes you want blur to occur if you're trying to do something in particular, like maybe you're photographing a waterfall or you're photographing traffic, you might want that shutter speed to be blurry, so you would adjust your speed based on that. So you really want to know how to use the shutter speed. So what I usually suggest you do is try different shutter speeds. So go out, take a photo, whether it's something moving or something still, and just start interacting with all the different shutter speeds. Then you can figure out what does what shutter speed based on what you have your camera set on. Also with shutter speed, sometimes you have to be careful if you have a low shutter speed. In addition to it being blurry, is if you're hand holding the camera and you're shaking a little bit, that will really cause it to be even more blurry, because if you're shaking a little bit, it's gonna pick up on it. So there is a rule when you have a lens on your camera. Say for instance, right now I have a 50mm lens on my camera. There's a rule saying you don't want to let your shutter speed get over 1 over the number of the millimeter of your lens. So I have a 50mm, so my shutter speed should not go below 1/60th of a second, because it's a 50mm and one above that is 60. Because then if I'm holding it, it could shake. Now if you have a tripod, you don't have to do this rule. This is only if you're hand holding your camera. So what if you are in a dark room or you're outside and it's a little dark and you're trying to adjust your shutter speed and you can't really get below 1/100th of a second? You're like, it's still too dark. So then you would move on to the next part in your triangle. And you can use these elements of the triangle in any way that's comfortable for you. You don't have to go in the order I'm doing it. This is the order I personally like them in. So the next element of the triangle would be the aperture. The aperture is really, in a simple way to explain it, is the opening of the lens in the camera, and that goes in and out and opens. So if you think about it, the more it opens, the more light lets in, and the smaller it is, the less light it lets in. Aperture is measured in what we call f-stops, so it's more fractions. So depending on what camera you have and what lens you have, your camera can go up and down for different f-stops. Another thing to know about aperture is it's not just the light that it lets in, it also changes your depth of field. Now the depth of field in simple terms is the amount of focus that your picture will be in. So for instance, I'm sure you've seen a lot of photos where the background's all blurry and all you see is the subject is in focus. Even some iPhones are doing that now with the portrait view. So you might look at that and be like, oh, how do I do that on a DSLR? Well, you have to have a lower f-stop. So like an f1.8, where the focus plane that's extremely slim. And if you take a picture, for instance, of a face, it's probably only the eyes that will be in focus. And then everything else will be blurry. So you may not want to ever go that low unless you just want to get one eye in focus. So you might pull it back up to a 3.2 or 2.8, or, you know, if you want everything in the photo, you could do something like an f16 or something like that. So once again, I suggest you take your camera, go outside, take an object or something, and practice with all these different f-stops. And then you can start learning how those make your photo look different, because it is very different to take a photo. For instance, say you were in a field and there were flowers. If you're taking pictures of the flowers and you want just maybe to isolate a few of the photos, you might use something like a 2.8 or an f3.2, and then everything else in the background would be really pretty and blurred. But maybe you want to get the whole field of flowers, and so you would want to go up to like an f16 or something, and then everything's going to be in focus. So there's so many different numbers in between there, but you want to try them all so you can get a really great feel for how each different f-stop can really change the focus of your photo, the artisticness of your photo, and what you're trying to say with the photo. One of my favorite things to do with depth of field and the aperture part of the triangle is you can really change how things look. For instance, if I'm photographing a wedding, say the bride is getting ready in a room that could be a little messy, so I could change my f-stop to be something like a 2.8, and it kind of blurs out the background and it can make it less distracting and less messy. So you can really do a lot of different things with the depth of field. So the third part of the exposure triangle is ISO. ISO is how it's spelled out, and this is the sensor in the camera and its sensitivity to light. So the lower this number is, the less sensitive your camera is to light, and the higher it is, the more light it lets in. So if you had something like 200 ISO, it's not letting in as much light, but if you go up to like a 1600 ISO, it lets in more light. But sometimes there's a trade-off in photography. So if you have your camera set on 200 ISO, because say you're outside, you can see that you don't need as much light on your sensor because the sun's coming in or whatever. But say you go inside and you have to turn your camera up to a 1600 or a 2000 ISO. Well, all of a sudden, you're having a lot more light coming in on that sensor, and so it can create what we call grain. Now, sometimes people like grain, but grain can get like, it could be colored grain where it's blue or green or red, and it can be really distracting in a photo, and you may not want that. So at that point, you might want to start thinking of doing external flashes to get some more of that light to come in, so you won't have to have a grainy photo. Because you can take a photo that you might really like, but if you say you wanted to get something blown up, it won't look as good if there's a lot of grain on it. So you do have to be mindful of that. So once again, I suggest you go out and try this and see which number you really like. Usually if I'm outside, I start at a 100 ISO because I really want to cut down on that grain. And depending on if I'm in the sun or the shade, we'll see what I want to change that to. But a lot of these modern day cameras can go up really high. So for instance, if I'm photographing a wedding and it's in a very dark venue, I can really bump that up, and there is a way to take out the grain later, but I prefer my photos to not have grain. And if you do end up taking grain out later, it can kind of look a little over smooth sometimes. So you always want to try to do things in camera as best you can. So once again, the three elements of the exposure triangle are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So in order to take a really good exposure, you need to know how all three of these legs of the triangle work together. And the best way to do this is to practice. I've given you just the very basic overview. This is a lot of stuff to learn, so I would suggest you go out, try it with your camera, and also read more about it. Once again, I can suggest this book, which I've already suggested to you in another video, Understanding Exposure by Brian Peterson. He has exercises in here, just like he does for the other sections on the exposure triangle, and it really helps you learn how to do all of this stuff, and it probably explains it much better than I did. The exposure triangle is one of the most important things in photography, so definitely take a lot of time and learn this, and if you have any questions, you can always ask me in the comments or send us a Facebook or Instagram message. So have a great day. I hope you enjoyed this exposure triangle lesson.